Welcome to this first session in Unit 308, Operational Management. In this session we're going to be looking at organisational strategy and operational plans. But before we get into that, in the introduction you should have watched the short video on strategic operational management functions. Just there to give us a taster, an overall view, sort of set the scene of where we're going to look at. You should have made some notes, just review a quick points from there that I thought were really important. One, I think it identifies that we should all be involved in some aspects of that, because it talks about operational management being that transformation of resources into goods or services, and we're all probably responsible at some point for helping to deliver with what we've been given the outcomes of the business. So that's the goods or service. Talked about 8 key areas and they highlighted 4 that I'd like to pick up on. The first was high level planning. We're not necessarily always going to be involved in that, but we are going to look at the process because we need to understand what's gone on so that we can be more effective. Because it talked about aligning our operational planning, which is what we will be doing, with the strategy. So we need to understand how the strategy has been formed. It also touched on supply chain management, talks about inputs and delivery of outputs, and we're all involved at some point in the delivery of outputs and the monitoring of that. And then finally it talked about quality management, and we should all be taking an involvement in that. And as managers we might need to be deciding how that's going to be measured and how we're going to resolve problems that link to that. So hopefully that was an insight, and it'll become more useful as you go through, because they made the point that understanding about all of this helps us to be more effective in our role. So we'll have a look at how that fits into our aims and objectives for this session. So then the aims for this session are to understand how organisational strategy is developed. As I mentioned before, it's about having that understanding so we know what's going on and know how to effectively implement operational team plans with given resources available. So by the end of this session, we should be able to explain the process of developing an organisational strategy, explain how the operational plans of departments and teams relate to that overall organisation's strategy, describe the actions needed to implement operational and team plans within agreed timescales and to budget, and explain how operational and team plans are revised in response to the change in operational objectives. So that's the change bit. Right, let's get started. Developing organisational strategy. We're going to have a look at the process and what's involved, but first let's ask us the question, why? Well, business is about winning, whether it's new customers, markets, contracts, awards, recognition, or just about meeting your own objectives. To win things you need a game plan, such as we see in sports teams. Normally it's the coach that sets out the plan, the tactics, and what we're going to go about. And this also applies to business and organisations as a whole, and even in your department, your team, and even yourself as an individual. That's why we have development plans and ideas about what we want to do. To be successful, you need to know how to best use the talent, skills, resources at your disposal to the best advantage of the organisation, and so that you can meet everyone's needs. And everyone needs to understand that game plan, if we're going to call it that strategic plan, that operational plan. They need to know what their part is they have to play if we're going to have any chance of being a winning team. So we need a strategic plan, and we're going to have to look at what sort of information needs to be included. But first we're going to look at a common sense sort of systematic approach to developing an effective strategy. In simple terms, there are 3 key areas. There's the analysis and assessment of the situation, of your context, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. There's then the formulation and the planning, and then key is the translation and promotion of that so that everyone understands. So let's have a look at how we can start the analysis and assessment. But really, before we get into those first steps of actually analysis and assessment, we really need to do, it is part of the analysis assessment, we need to determine what sort of thing we want the strategy to be about. You must understand your full internal and external sort of factors and the environment that affect you. For example, if your business is for a for-profit business, so normal business trying to make money, then you're going to be competing with other customers, competing with others for your customers, for profits, for market share. Whereas if you're a non-profit organisation, such as a charity, a voluntary organisation, or a government department, those sort of goals might not be quite as important. And we need to fully understand these factors so that we can look at the clear advantages that we have and where we can be successful. And from there, you can make some informed choices about what you want from your strategy. And there are a number of suggestions now coming up on the screen. It could be things such as increased profitability. Might just be trying to come in under budget. It might be about increasing approval ratings with customers or with some sort of authority that we get approval from. It might be about being the market leader, or just about increasing market share, or it could be about being innovative, being at the cutting edge. But that will be the decision of your organisation to make when they've considered what their factors are and what sort of things they want to set out as their sort of overall aim. So we've identified there are 3 key areas in developing our organisational strategy, and the first 2 areas were analysis and assessment and formulation of a plan, and we can really sort of bring those together into a 3-stage process. We're going to start looking at that now, and some of this is around the similar areas we've looked at in 316 about problem solving, because the first part is we need to start to analyse the context which the organisation is operating in, and we've already started to just touch that with deciding whether we're profit making, non-profit making, and what we actually want out of our strategy. The second point, after analysing the context, is to identify options. Think about strategic options that we could take ahead, and all options should be on the table. And then thirdly, as we were doing problem solving, it's about evaluating and selecting the viable or best option. So let's break those down and have a look at those in a bit more detail. So the first stage 1, is about analysing the context and environment of the organisation. And this builds on what we said at the beginning about making sure we fully understand what we want from our strategy. So in taking that further, we need to look at the context. We need to think about examining what resources, liabilities, capabilities, strengths and weaknesses we have. SWOT's a good tool for that. Remember in 314, 315 we did a personal SWOT. So SWOTs are good at drawing out what you're good at and what your weaknesses are as an organisation, so that you can build the strategy and play to the strengths and not expose the weaknesses. Need to be rigorous and honest when you're doing it. It's no good trying to look at weaknesses and not being honest. And it's also about identifying the core competencies or the USPs that make you stand out from your competitors. So that's about finding out the context. And then there's the environment. We need to be looking at the current operating environment of your sector, the industry, what's going on, where are things, what's going to be happening, what's coming in the future. We might have to be predicting any new or exciting opportunities, any changes that we'll need to pursue, any future scenarios, what the impact could be on you as an organisation, any new competitors coming into the market. A pest analysis is good for that. Political, economic, social and technological changes that are coming which could have an impact, and they can be used to analyse these sort of areas. So overall, we've got to analyse the context and the environment so that we can be aligned with any changes that may come up in the environment we're working in. We don't want to be working against them. Look at retailers that didn't take on board internet shopping and where that left them. Because many of those external factors are out of your control, and if you're pursuing something that they impact on, you could be spending a lot of time working against something that's just going to be unprofitable and just not going to work for you in the long term. We also don't want to forget about customers, stakeholders. We talked about that in 302 session 1 about how you identify your customers and your stakeholders, because they're all part of that environment as we move forward. Stage 2 is about identifying strategic options, and we're really into the problem solving territory that we talked about in unit 316 here, because we're trying to create things that will give us a clear advantage to meeting our objectives, and that could include brainstorming through the areas that were identified in the SWOT so that we can start mapping out processes and perhaps examining any root causes of previous problems and issues. What were they? Were they solved? If they weren't solved, what went wrong? And if they were solved, how effective was it? So no options off the table, brainstorming, just trying to come up with things that we could do that would create a clear advantage, which could help us meet our overall objective, which might be to increase our market share, might be to make more profit, whatever we decided was that sort of overall thing. So this is where the team that are involved in this, the senior people, are going to be sitting around thinking, what things can we do to put us in a good position? And stage 3 is about evaluate and select options. And we're now into that decision-making territory, the sort of techniques we talked about in Unit 316, because we must evaluate, consider every option and look at which one's best. We need to don't want to make a final judgment until we've compared them all and looked at them all, and also looked back at stage 1 and see how each of them fits into the context and the environment. We'll be using things we talked about in 316 here, such as decision trees, decision matrices, or paired comparisons. They'll be useful tools, and it's about deciding what the strengths are of each one and then taking on board financial considerations and looking at cost benefit analysis, etc. And finally, we will come up, or they should come up, with selected strategies that we can identify that will help us to pursue those overall objectives that have been identified. And then this is when it gets really hard, because developing a good strategy, people say, is the easy bit. It's about implementing it successfully, and that's where it normally goes wrong in a lot of businesses. At this stage, that plan or that strategic plan just sits on the shelf and nobody really sort of puts into action. And we looked at the beginning about 3 areas that need to be, and the third was about translation and promotion. And translating this plan, this strategic plan, and promoting it so that everyone understands it is where it really, really matters. So hopefully we've been through that process and we've got our strategy now. It's written, it's decided, but the third area that we talked about, which I said was really, really important right back at the beginning, was that translate and promote. And for that, we can use the 3 C's as a guide. And when put it into place, we need to try and make sure we follow these. And the first is to clarify the strategy, because it needs to be understood by everyone at every level, not just by the senior management who perhaps wrote it. We need to make sure that it can be expressed in terms of operational plans as well, and we're going to look at those in a little bit more, and that people can connect with it, and even down to individuals' objectives and how they can fit into achieving those targets or objectives. And then we need to make sure that we're communicating that strategy in as many ways as possible. We need to be getting out there to the biggest audience. So that could be electronically, face-to-face, in one-to-one meetings and team meetings, in broadcasts across our intranet. We need to have a desired impact. And to do that, we need to make sure that as many people get to read it in as many ways as possible so that they can understand it and take on board the new focus or the new direction and how it will inform the way they actually work. And finally, we need to be cascading the strategy. What are the mechanics of it? We need to be getting the nuts and bolts out there to managers, department managers, the practicalities of putting it into practice, applying it within their own departments, any additional training or processes that may need to be improved for it to take place. So it's about getting them involved so that they can be talking to people in their departments and they can be cascading the strategy down, and probably going back and helping the clarification of the strategy and making sure that it's in the language that's required. So this is how we make the strategy become reality. It's about putting it into practice so that it can ultimately be successful, and we'll start to examine the mechanics of how we go about that once we get the message out there and what needs to be done to make it come to fruition. So if we're successful, if it's clear, if it's communicated well, we can start to cascade it, and the cascading will be because managers will write it into their everyday operational plans and planning. That we talked about them, basic tool that sets the direction of day-to-day activities, just tells people what will be going on, what they're doing in their departments, their teams, and down to individual level it can be mapped back to that. It's how managers make staff aware of what they want them to do and when they want them to do it, and the purpose, the key to that, should be able to be mapped back into the organisational strategy. So it's really important that everyone understands it. So the organisational strategy is going to show the big plan, the vision, the context, the environment, what options have been selected. It gives the authority to deliver what's wanted, and it's the overall long-term objective for the organisation. The operational plan communicates that direction. What day-to-day actions do we need to carry out? How and when are we going to carry out those? What resources have we got? And then you can set shorter term objectives based on the overall objectives. And then finally, for the individual, it identifies their part. What is their role? How are they part of the strategy? What are their responsibilities? What are their short-term goals? And also into the areas they can improve on and where they'll need to build capacity to meet those objectives. If the strategy hasn't been understood, if the process of the 3 C's hasn't worked, then the process of breaking it down and integrating it, including it in operational plans, just isn't going to happen. It's a bit back to the sports scenario. You can have all the best tactics, all the best plans in the world, but once the team goes out on the pitch, they're in the game, it's up to them. And if they don't understand, then it's not going to work. And this is where, as middle managers, team leaders, or supervisors, we're going to get more involved, and we'll start to get involved in some key actions in trying to translate and promote that strategy out in our operational plans to the teams and the individuals. And the first part is about continuing to translate that strategy into operational plans. It's about breaking it down. So it'll be about mapping out processes, working out and allocating roles and responsibilities so that we can communicate in the operational plan to people how they're going to work, what they're going to be doing, and what they're taking responsibility for. And part of it is for us to focus on helping them realise where that fits in to the overall organisational objectives, so that we can write them smart objectives telling them what they're doing specifically, when, how, and what the timescales are. And it's about communicating all that in team meetings, individual meetings, promotion of the overall plan. We need to make sure people understand what the department and team is doing, understand how they're supported by other departments or other teams, and how they're supporting other teams, so they can see how they're a cog in the wheel moving forward to those overall objectives. And then there's planning. We need some sort of project plan or something that enables us to check progress of tasks so they could be measured on and reported within the team and upwardly to management. There's resource planning, so that supplies, making sure things are there for people when they are needed, and making sure that we've got the right people, the right skills and training. So that might be about providing the provision of training and development for staff so they can better undertake their tasks, especially if it enables them to understand how they're contributing to the operational plan and therefore the overall strategy. And then finally, it's about identifying costs and timescales. So establishing what those costs and what's available, and then being able to monitor and track against them so that we can add that into the planning. So we've established that the operational plan is a plan to get the strategic ideas to delivery. So it might be more customers, more market share, increased profitability, reducing costs, whatever that strategic objective is. And the sort of operational management tasks that might be carried out in the sort of putting that plan into practice be things such as regularly monitoring and investigating what has been achieved and what has not been achieved against those smart objectives we've written, implementing corrective actions where tasks have not been achieved or they're not on time, monitoring, confirming the resources that will be available and are available when required, so that's resource management. Supporting and motivating team members to ensure that they get their tasks undertaken and that they feel confident. Adjusting plans and objectives where needed, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And reporting on issues of progression to superiors like line managers, directors, board members, committees, depend on the organisation's situation. So let's expand on a couple of those. So let's think about SMART objectives and ensuring that those objectives link to the wider objectives. We need to ensure that we've broken down processes properly, that's workflow processes, so that we can link individual people into those objectives. For example, could be an overall objective strategically could be to boost customer satisfaction ratings, and you may have a team that just deals with the customer's paperwork, I don't know, invoices and orders, etc., and don't have any direct contact with them. But setting an objective around timely completion, accuracy of communication with the sales team, for example, based on breaking down the processes could have a significant impact in your team helping that other team and that meeting the overall objective. And also, well-written SMART objectives allow for proper monitoring and timely completion, because if they've got good timely objectives in there, it means that we can check them. So for example, an objective around that around that timely completion of paperwork might be about ensuring that processes are all completed within 24 hours and entered onto the system, and any errors or issues are passed to customer service on a weekly reconciliation reporting, say each Friday. But having those timely objectives in there means that people can be held and things can be monitored properly to check that we're meeting those objectives. Planning those team objectives along with the resources, including people, time, equipment, it's only going to be achievable if they have sufficient people, say for that last one we talked about, if you only have sufficient people for processing those orders so they can be done within 24 hours, and that they have access to the system, they receive the orders on time, and that they can access customer services and have the materials and information to do the reconciliation and reporting. So we'll need to make sure those resources are in place, and that'll be about maximising resources and identifying any shortfalls. There may be busy periods for orders, periods when they can't access the system, or if it's production and manufacturing, it may be the use of equipment, planned outages, knowing when we can get hold of stuff. So we're going to need some sort of resource plan linked to workflow patterns that can show maximum usage out of certain resources. You know, if you've only got one machine and there's 4 teams or 4 departments that need to access it, there's going to have to be some sort of workflow plan to show when they can access it and who's going to have it at what time, so that it isn't double booked and that people aren't just standing around waiting for availability. And finally, as came up there, that will all help with the agreed budgets and timescales and making sure that we've used our resources properly and made sure they fit in within those timescales and budgets. Another area I'd like to just expand on, we mentioned adjustments, so changes. We're going to look at change management in more detail in the next session, but why might things change? Even the best laid plans need to be revised, and the change might be due to things we talked about previously. Context and environment. Strengths and weaknesses may change, new opportunities may arise, things that may threaten the business can all come about. And in the environment, it could be things like the market changing, customers changing, stakeholders, competition changing, and we need to react to these things, otherwise we're going to suffer. So context and environment, things that are major ones could be, but there could also be other things such as factors that can also impact things like human, financial, risk and operational factors. So we'll have a look at those in individual detail. Firstly, human factors. People are a massive big variable. They're going to have a massive impact on or influence on our success and whether the plan works, and we'll need to monitor this and make sure we have enough people in place with the right skills and the right experience. Yes, we could put all the training in place and have planned everything, but they might not perform, or key people may leave, or people may be off sick, so we'll need to monitor it all the time. Financial factors. Well, we could have planned and considered all the financial fixtures, all our budget constraints and expenses, and we we'll be monitoring those, but our plans were based on estimates and predictions, and they're with as much accuracy as possible, but profit margins can change, costs can change, and we'll need to monitor and adjust things as required. And this may change our plans. We may have to scale things back, or we may have to look at different timescales. Risk factors. We've talked about risk factors before, and in the planning someone will have looked at those, made all the considerations possible, but there is always risk if we're trying to make improvements, and that's normally what a strategic plan is about. And we're trying to move things forward and change things, and we can have all the contingency in the world, but we may not be able to predict everything that's going to happen, and we'll need to monitor that and adjust plans as necessary. And then operational factors, the actual implementation of the plan, timescales, milestones that we've set in place. There'll be guide points that we've sort of said, well, this is at this point we're going to check this, at this point we're going to check that. For example, we talked about the training was planned, but did it really meet its objectives? We were going to get a new supplier by this date and they don't come through on time, so we may have to revise our plans and make changes. As I said, we're going to look more about how we actually go about making changes within our team in the next session, but we're just now going to have a recap of what we've covered along organisational strategy and operational plans. So, just to recap on what our aims and objectives were for this session, or the first start of this session was to understand how organisational strategies develop. We've talked about areas, the 3 areas, and then the stages we go through and what we need to do to make it happen, and then know how to effectively implement operational team plans and given the resources available. We've talked about how those plans might be put in place, how they're linked to the the organisational strategy, how we use SMART objectives, etc., and how different teams may rely on other teams to get them through that. So we hopefully by now can explain the process of developing an organisational strategy, explain how the operational plans of departments and teams relate to the overall organisational strategy, describe the actions needed to implement operational team plans within agreed timescales and budgets, and explain how operational and team plans are revised in response to changes in the organisational objectives. So, quick activity, and then we'll move on to managing change. Okay then, at the end of this overall unit, there is a unit assignment, but this little activity will be useful and you'll be able to use the information you gather from this in your end of unit assignment, because what I want you to do is review your organisation's strategic plan, its strategy, and write a report. So you're going to need to get access or find out how you get to find out what is in your organisation's strategic plan. Now, this should be available in some format. You may need to go and talk to your line manager about it. You may need to do a bit of research, but you really want to find it and get a copy so you can, if you don't already know about it, to see where you link in with that plan. In your report, I want you to explain the 3 stages of the process of developing a strategy that we've talked about, and where possible, link it to some examples or outcomes from your organisation's plan. This is so you can highlight where you think. Now, remember, you're not going to necessarily be able to put every specific fact in there, because some of the information in your organisational strategy may be sensitive, it may be specific to your environment, and you won't be able to include it, but you can make judgments or opinions about how they've gone through the process, using it as an example of explaining how they might have gone through the process to get through stages 2 and 3 of the plan. So a report, it's probably going to be a reasonably long report because there's quite a lot to get in there, but just talk about how a strategic plan, what the process is, how it's put together, and use some examples from your own strategic plan from your organisation, and that should help you in sort of getting to grips with what's in your plan and how it fits to your organisational plans.